So my main camera, the one I'm filming on now, and what I use for most of my photography is the Sony a7R V. It is a 61 megapixel camera, which is pretty much the highest you can get until you get into the medium format stuff. But the question is, do I really need that many megapixels? And do you really need that many megapixels? Well, let's talk about that. What's up, my name's Chris Tayez. I'm a photographer and videographer based in Ontario, Canada. I mainly shoot portraits, events, weddings. I do a lot of corporate stuff and commercial stuff on the video side. Basically, if there's a person involved, I'm gonna be photographing them. And through my time of making these kinds of photographs, I've used lots of different sizes of sensors, anywhere from 12 megapixels with my Canon 5D, all the way up to the 61 megapixel camera, and in between using the Fuji X-H2 with the 40 megapixel crop sensor, using the A7 IV with a 33 megapixel sensor, using the Lumix S5 IIX with a 26 megapixel sensor. It's been all over the place. And I've kind of come to the decision that for me, megapixels kind of do matter and kind of don't. And we're gonna get into that. But the way I'm gonna kind of set this up is we're going to look at the technical side of things. We're gonna look at some real world examples, and then we're gonna talk about some pros and cons of the whole high megapixel, low megapixel count, and hopefully give you a sense of why it matters and if it does matter to you at all. Starting with the difference between PPI and DPI. PPI is pixels per inch, and that is totally relative to what you see on a screen. And DPI is dots per inch, and that is relative to how many physical dots are being printed onto a 1 inch by 1 inch square area of a piece of paper. So starting with PPI, pixels per inch. Now this is a digital form of resolution, and it has everything to do with how many pixels are in a square inch of a screen. A higher PPI means more resolution, while a lower PPI means lower resolution. So when we're talking about PPI, pixels per inch, we really want to think about what format our images are going to be seen on. And you don't really have a ton of control over that, to be honest. I mean, you might see them on your MacBook screen, and that's at anywhere from 220 to 280 PPI depending on what screen you have. Somebody else might be viewing it on a lower resolution screen or a higher resolution screen than that, or for example on your phone, which is somewhere, if you're using the latest iPhone, it's at like 460 PPI. So there's a broad range, and it's very, very relative to how it's being viewed. And the larger the screen, the more important that is too, because people are typically using different viewing distances as well. And this is where it gets complicated. So PPI is something that ultimately we don't really have a lot of control over, because usually we don't control where people see our footage or our pictures. DPI, however, is something that we have control over. So DPI is the amount of dots per inch, meaning that in the image itself, per square inch, how many dots are physically being printed onto that square inch. The kind of gold standard is 300 DPI. However, most printers are gonna have the ability to go way, way higher than that. But 300 DPI is seen as sort of what we look at as our standard image. Essentially what this means is that a higher DPI, just like PPI, means a denser amount of dots in a square inch, which means sharper images. Now, DPI is all relative to viewing distance. You can have a lower DPI with a further viewing distance. For example, a 300 DPI image, technically they say that you want to view that at just under 12 inches away. That means that that is where you're going to actually take advantage of that higher resolution. But it is totally relative to the size of the image that you're actually printing. Now, in real world use, what this means is that you want to take the overall diagonal of the print and multiply it by 1.5 times, and that's going to be the minimum viewing distance that's going to be pleasing for us to be able to actually take in the full image. And the maximum is 2 times. So essentially, for example, if you're using a 61 megapixel camera here, and we're at a full res, and we're at 300 DPI, that means that we are going to create an image that is 21 inches by about 32 inches, 21 by 31.7 technically. That creates a diagonal of 38 inches. That means that our minimum viewing distance of that is going to be 57 inches away, and our maximum is going to be 76 inches away. Now, as you get further away from that 11.46 inches, which is that sort of technical viewing distance of 300 DPI, you actually bring down the total dots per inch that are needed in order to see similar resolution. So if, as we move further away, we actually need less DPI, that means that in our example of that 20 by 30 print, if if we're viewing it at 57 inches, our actual minimum DPI is 64, far lower than 300. That doesn't mean you should print it at 64 DPI. It just means that at 64 DPI, you would still get the benefit of the resolution that you're shooting at as your minimum. However, that is relative to whether or not people are standing the further distance away that is sort of like technically appropriate for the image. And chances are they probably aren't. If that's sounding complicated, it is, but I think the takeaway here is to ask yourself, am I printing my photos? And if I am, what size am I printing them at and how are people viewing them? If I'm putting them into a photo book, they're gonna be viewing them closer than if they're sitting on a wall. So it's all relative to how you're choosing to print them. If you're not printing them, that's where something like PPI might be a little bit more important, and resolution can play a role there too. Now, to kind of cap off this technical side of things, let's talk about pixel pitch. Pixel pitch is the distance between the center of one pixel to the center of the next pixel beside it. With me? Maybe. So if we have a full frame sensor and there's 12 megapixels, there's gonna be a greater distance between the center of each pixel compared to the 61 megapixel camera that I'm shooting with right now. Now, simply put, that just means that we have a higher resolution camera relative to pixel pitch based on the full frame sensor. If we were to multiply everything on that 12 megapixel and get it up to 61 megapixels, but we increased that sensor size, it would be relative in terms of pixel pitch again. So if we try and follow this logic, really what we want to think about is where our images are going to be seen online as well. And for most of us, that's probably on places like Instagram, on someone's phone, maybe on our website, which usually people are, again, looking at on their phone, or they might be looking at, on their computer, something like that. But generally speaking, we're not going to have our images blown up really big on a screen very often. So that means that the PPI is somewhat irrelevant, because as the screen gets smaller, yes, you're seeing like a higher PPI on something like an iPhone. However, the viewing size and the distance and everything is just so much smaller that in real world application, it doesn't really matter that much. In fact, if we look at that as a comparison, what I did here is I took the Canon 5D and the A7R5 and I put the same lens on them. It's the Sigma 50mm f1.4 art that is for Canon, and I just adapted it over to the Sony here. If we look at these on my computer at the same frame size, we really can't see much of a difference. Yes, there's going to be differences in color rendition and things like that, but the overall sharpness, you don't really see much. It's when we zoom in that we start to see a difference, right? And this is obvious. If we zoom into a 60 megapixel file versus a 12 megapixel file, we are going to see a cleaner, sharper image. But the question of how much sharper and how much that matters is kind of up to you. There's a few big reasons people give for going into a higher megapixel camera, and one of the big ones is cropping, so that they can crop in and not get a lower resolution image. Now, to be clear, when you actually crop into an image, you are not changing the resolution of that technical image, right? The pixel pitch isn't changing. The only place that it changes is when you crop in and then you expand. So if I take the full size image from this A7R5 and I crop into it, if I leave it at that crop size, I'm not changing the resolution. It's when I then blow that up to make it bigger that I'm actually changing the resolution overall, and I'm getting a lower res image. Meaning that if I were to take an image off of the 61 megapixel sensor and I were to display it on a screen, and then if I were to take that same image and I were to crop it in by 50% and display it on the same size screen, I will notice a resolution drop if I pixel peep. However, if I were to take that full image and I were to crop in and display only that cropped image at that crop size, technically I'm not going to see a loss of resolution, but I'm going to see, a smaller image. And ultimately that's not really all that helpful. So in real world practice, how does this all work, and how does it affect our image making? Well, we know that exporting from RAW to JPEG does compress things, but it doesn't really affect the quality all that much. I can never really notice a difference if I'm exporting at 85 or higher in Lightroom. I'm seeing good quality images that look very similar to the RAW file at the very beginning. So that means that the big benefit of using a higher megapixel camera comes in the form of cropping, of course, being able to crop in and blow up that image and have a higher resolution file than you would if you used a lower resolution camera. Secondly, being able to print large prints at high resolution with a closer viewing distance. If we know that our images are going to be viewed closer, but we want them to be larger, then having a higher resolution camera is helpful for that. Number 3, if we are taking a photo of something and it is of utmost importance that we preserve the maximum amount of detail and sharpness in that image, and we have the accompanying lens to allow us to do that and the lighting and everything else, higher resolution cameras will be more effective for that. The best example of this would be something like macro photography, where let's say we're doing a product photography shot and we need to get the maximum amount of detail possible on an image that is actually punched in quite a bit, where we are using a macro lens to get as close as possible and we want really fine detail. A high resolution camera is going to do that really well. It doesn't mean you can't do it with a lower resolution camera, it just means that if you're going to be really particular about it, then a high res camera is probably helpful. For me, the final and most helpful advantage of it is being able to crop in camera so that you can effectively see your framing a little bit better. And I made a whole video about this that I put out last week that you can watch, all about the APS-C crop mode on Sony cameras, and it applies to other camera brands that have that crop mode and why I think it's helpful. But there's also some drawbacks, and I think that the big drawbacks people talk about are cost. A high resolution camera is almost always more expensive than the lower resolution version of it. Take the A7R5 versus the A7 IV. Second one is low light performance. Everybody talks about this. If you have a higher resolution camera, the low light performance typically does take a little bit of a hit, and that's because each actual pixel is smaller, so its ability to take in information versus kind of balancing out the amount of signal noise that's coming in is affected. Essentially, it just means that if you want beautiful low light performance, like the best possible, a lower megapixel camera might do that better for you. But sensor technology is improving so rapidly that even on this, I can shoot comfortably at 10,000 ISO and know that I'm gonna get a fairly clean image. The third one is storage, and this kind of applies to cost as well, which is that you have to store these images. If you're using a high megapixel camera, you have to store a lot more information with every single shot. If you're shooting on burst mode because you're doing, fast action or something like that, you're gonna get a lot of files. And that means that you're gonna have a lot of storage that you're gonna need. That means that you're going to be paying more for that storage. Lastly is readout speed or rolling shutter and stuff like that. The readout speed on a high resolution camera is just never as good as on a low resolution camera, unless it's like a stacked sensor, something like the Sony A1 II that just came out, where you can have a 50 megapixel camera that is shooting quite fast. But overall, just the rolling shutter, the readout speed is going to be higher on a higher megapixel camera. And so if that bothers you, then that's something you have to think about. To me, that doesn't really matter. Like, rolling shutter is not something I really care about for what I shoot. And I think most people probably overemphasize the importance of it. What I will say though is that a higher megapixel camera with more rolling shutter means that it has a longer readout speed, means that you probably can't shoot as high burst rate, which might be important for you if you're shooting something like sports. So that's that. Those are the benefits and the drawbacks, the real world application, and some of the technical stuff around why you may or may not need a high resolution camera. The question is now, like, where's the sweet spot? What is enough megapixels for you to be able to do what you need to do and still get the quality that you need and not break the bank? Most people are still saying like the kind of sweet spot is that 24 to 26 megapixels, and I would agree with that. I think 33 megapixels in the A7 IV is really nice. That gives you a little bit more benefit. The only reason really that I went with the A7R5 is so that I could do that in-camera cropping and still have a 26 megapixel image when I cropped in. I can also shoot this in raw medium, which gives me a same 26 megapixel image. So my full frame and then my cropped in image are all the same size when I go to actually use them later. And I find that helpful, and it just helps me on wedding day to get it right in camera. But you have to ask yourself what you're using it for, and that's sort of the take home of this. So thanks for watching, appreciate it. Leave a comment down below if this makes sense to you, if it doesn't, if this is boring, if this is great. Tell me what you had for lunch. Is it lunchtime? Okay, see you later.